Space zombie movies promote the idea that ETs travel hundreds of light years across the galaxy just to eat human brains. It's a lot of trouble for lunch, but that idea works in Hollywood. Of course, it isn't realistic, so what do ETs eat? Obviously, the answer varies, but here's what some contactees say. Frank lived a long way from town, so he had a mailbox by the highway and checked it only every few days. One time, he opened the door to his mailbox to find a large padded envelope with no return or delivery address. Puzzled, he flipped it over, but it was blank on both sides. Tearing open the envelope and looking inside, he saw several shriveled roots. Each was a few inches long and about an inch wide. He dumped them into his hand, picked one up with his fingers, and looked at it carefully from all sides. Thinking this must be some prank by the local kids, he started to throw them away. But then, his intuition kicked in, and he knew that the package was from the ETs. This was so typical of them, sending a mysterious package with no information. Ever the tricksters, they enjoyed doing things that stumped him and made him work to figure things out. Not knowing what to do with the dried shriveled roots, he put them back in the envelope. After arriving home, he placed the envelope on the kitchen counter and didn't think about it until the next morning. As he stared at the shriveled roots, he received a one-word telepathic message. Water. Okay, but what did that mean? Soak them in water? Sprinkle water on them? He took the easiest way, got a glass from the kitchen cabinet, filled it about half full of water, and dropped in one shriveled root. Nothing happened right away, but when he checked the next morning, the dried root was getting larger. On the second morning, he was surprised to find the root sticking well above the glass. It appeared to have absorbed all the water and regained its full size, which was about 10 to 15 times larger. Leaning in to look at it, he thought that it looked vaguely like a carrot, except it was tan instead of orange. He thought that maybe it was a carrot-shaped potato. It didn't look exactly like anything he'd ever seen. Frank sniffed it, and it smelled sweet and fresh. He was certain the ETs would not try to poison him, so he cut off a small piece with a knife and tasted it. It was crunchy with a pleasant flavor, vaguely like a cross between a potato and a carrot. Frank was not sure what more to do with the vegetable, so he waited for more information. But the ETs were silent, although he knew they would tell him eventually. About 6 months later, Frank was walking to his recliner in his front room when he noticed something gray and wispy looking under the chair. Is that a dust ball? He wondered, remembering that his mother called them dust bunnies. But something was off. He had dusted the day before, and there was nothing under the chair then. Kneeling to look closer, he carefully picked up what looked like a 1-inch wide round dust bunny. But he instantly knew it wasn't dust. It was whitish gray, stiff, and springy, a little like steel wool with lots of strands bunched up into a ball. Holding it close to his eyes, he became certain that it was not metal. Instead, it looked organic. Suddenly, it hit him, it was another dried ET vegetable of some kind. Frank put the dust bunny into a glass of water and went about his day. When he looked at it again in the morning, he was surprised to see that all the water in the glass was gone, and the ball had expanded to nearly fill up the entire glass. Leaning in, he could see that the glass was laced with thin strands that looked like tiny roots. Miniature green leaves grew from the end of each root. It reminded him of alfalfa sprouts, but as with the carrot potato, it didn't look exactly like anything he had ever seen before. Frank still didn't know why the ETs were showing him these dried vegetables, and the ETs weren't telling him. So, he just shrugged and put them out of his mind. About a month later, Frank was meditating in his recliner when he heard a high-pitched tone a little like an electronic doorbell, but it wasn't his. Frank opened his eyes and looked over to the door in time to see a Nordic slowly walk right through the stone wall. Not through the door, but through the wall. The ET came through as if in tiny slices. That is, Frank first saw his foot, hand, chest and nose in that order. Then, within about a second, the rest of him gradually came through the wall until the ET was entirely inside the room. There was never any opening in the wall, The Nordic just appeared to gradually materialize on one side of it. The Nordic's hand was resting on a small round device on his belt, and after he came through the wall, he lifted it off. The Nordic greeted Frank and then walked over to shake hands with him. Immediately, Frank thought that was odd. The ETs rarely shake hands the way humans do unless they're living on this planet pretending to be human. The Nordic picked up his thoughts and said, "I just wanted to show you that this body is real in your world. My solid body just came through your solid wall as if it were not there. It was because of this," he said, pointing to the device on his belt. Frank had already guessed that the shiny device materialized and dematerialized the ET's body. Changing the subject to the ET vegetables, the Nordic told Frank that they grow them on their home planet, as well as in space in extensive gardens on their motherships. Some of their ships are so huge that they have entire forests inside, somewhat like Earth cities that put buildings around wooded city parks. Or like giant arboretums inside cities that contain multiple biomes of different plants and animals. To preserve vegetables for storage on long voyages, they have a technique for compressing the molecular structure, which removes nearly 100% of the water from the plants but does not reduce the nutritional content. Once preserved, the dried food can be stored for years and does not spoil or decay. When they want to reconstitute the vegetables, they have a process that adds water. Once revived, the plant tastes like it did when it was first harvested. Amazingly, the vegetable will continue to grow if replanted. Howard Menger reported having a similar experience with dried ET vegetables, and like Frank, he was told that the ETs were able to remove nearly all of the water. In previous meetings, the Nordics explained that their culture was vegetarian. They said that not all ET civilizations are vegetarian. Like Earth, some less advanced civilizations are still meat eaters. The Nordics mostly ate fruits of the flower, rather than the plants that grow the flowers. For earthly plants, that would mean things such as bananas, apples, cucumbers, tomatoes, pecans, and walnuts, all of which grow from seeds and also contain seeds. The Nordic told him that eating these is best for physical and spiritual health because it represents cooperation with the plant kingdom. Plants produce fruits of the flower for animals and people to eat so that their seeds get spread around. That's harmonious, everybody wins, the plants and the animals. Howard Menger mentioned Frank's vegetable experience without using Frank's name. Even back then, Frank preferred anonymity. Menger wrote, "This individual, meaning Frank, had been given samples of processed food from an ET base on the moon which he had kept in his possessions for 8 months, not being sure what he should do with it, and asked my advice." Menger suggested to Frank that they use a reputable laboratory in Philadelphia to analyze the specimens. The results were surprising. The potato-like dried vegetable contained nearly 7 times the protein as a dried potato. The head of the laboratory said they had never investigated anything like it and was intrigued. He suggested that Frank and Howard take the specimens to a nearby government research laboratory with more sophisticated instruments. He had already made the arrangements. The two of them left the samples at the lab. Howard wrote about what happened. About 2 weeks later, my wife, my friend, and I went to the lab to check on the progress of the analysis. We were shown into a room where a piece of a specimen was in a container of water, another piece was in another container, and a small fragment was under a huge microscope. We took turns looking through the microscope. We were told they would run all sorts of tests on the specimens left with them and keep us informed, and that we were also welcome to come to the lab any time we wished to watch the progress of the experiments. After that, everything changed. That was in June 1958, and the last we heard from the laboratory. I understand that it has now become classified information. The government lab would not give Howard and Frank any more information and even refused to acknowledge they had received anything from them. Luckily, Frank had retained some samples. Later, in several experiments, Frank tried to achieve extreme dehydration of earth vegetables, followed by rehydration. However, he could never recapture the original fresh taste the way the ETs did. They had used some unknown processing and would not explain how they did it.